Hello, everybody. Okay, we're continuing on our series on Christianity in the Caribbean. And this week we are in week 12, I believe. And we're going to be talking about the soldiers, slaves, and saints of Trinidad. This is based on a book by Victor Ken Cadette, Slaves, Soldiers, and Saints, Poland, 200 Years of Baptist Witness in Trinidad, 1816 to 2016. Published by the World Baptist Alliance, Falls Church, Virginia. So let's jump right in. Um, so, similar to the situation with George Lael that we talked about last week, these Baptist soldiers were British soldiers. They were African slaves or Afro descendant slaves who agreed to fight for the British against the American colonialists in exchange for their freedom. And of course, as you know the story, in the War of Independence of 1776, the British lost, and so they evacuated their soldiers as well as their slaves and other loyalists who were, that is, the slaves that had fought for the British, were evacuated from the 13 colonies to the Bahamas, and eventually some were evacuated on to uh, Nova Scotia, Sierra Leone, and one group of 8,000 loyalists and slaves moved to Jamaica, where George Lael began his ministry as the apostle to Jamaica. This is a different group of British soldiers of color after the War of 1812. Once again, the British lose that battle and keep their promise to their Afro-American allies who fought for them, grant them their freedom, and they transport them, I think initially to the Bahamas, then eventually to Trinidad. So these groups were transferred to Trinidad, and they ended up starting Baptist churches. The loyal slaves who fought on the British side in the American War of Independence were formed into a regiment known as the South Carolina Corps in 1782. This black regiment engaged in military action in the USA and against the French in Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, and Grenada. In 1798, they were given the title the 1st West India Regiment. After the War of 1812, tens of thousands of blacks who had fled to England, the English, were taken to the British West Indian islands of Jamaica and the Bahamas. The war was an opportunity for the slaves to escape. Whenever the British ships came to shore for provisions on the eastern seaboard of the United States, slaves deserted the plantations and gave themselves over to the British. Some were organized as the Black Colonial Marine Corps in 1814. There was an official approval to this trend as slaves were deserting the plantations prior to the proclamation of 1814. So there are two reasons why so many of the slaves who escaped were accepted by the British. One was that the British needed the manpower in the military services. The second was that the British were moving towards a resolution of the issue of slavery in their colonies, and they had already outlawed slave trading in 1807. And so the British were supportive of the quest of Afro American slaves for their freedom from slavery. It's ironic that at the end of the American War of Independence, the slaves who fought against the British, gave their lives for the freedom of a nation, found themselves still enslaved. National independence and personal freedom were so recently achieved were not privileges that Black American slaves shared in the early 19th century. So, what this is saying is basically on the American side, many slaves fought for the Americans against the British, but then returned to slavery after the war. Whereas the British attempted to keep their promises to the slaves and provide them their freedom from slavery after the war, those slaves that fought for the British. And so here is I don't know if I can open this picture. Let me see if I can do this. No, I don't think I can. Okay, so I have in my slide, I have a picture of Trinidad, but I'm not going to be able to pull it up here. Trinidad was the first settled in 4000 BC. It was visited by Christopher Columbus in 1498. After periods under Spain, France, and the Dutch, Trinidad was formally ceded to Great Britain in 1802. So you can see it has quite a diverse background, beginning under Spain, then the French, then the Dutch. French and Africans formed the majority groups in Trinidad. Roman Catholicism remained the dominant religion, and although the country was governed by Spain, that is prior to 1802, the French language and culture dominated Trinidad. As historian Eric Williams put it, Spain reigns, but France governs. Roman Catholicism and Spanish economic interests were the threads that held the two cultures together, that is, the Spanish and the French in Trinidad. As the British government took over the rule of Trinidad in the early 19th century, they focused on the economic and infrastructural development of Trinidad. Persons who would commit to these objectives were encouraged to migrate to the island. The black soldiers who fought with the British armed forces against the Americans were candidates for the situation because as military men they had grown accustomed to hardship and privation, and they had been exposed to English culture. Therefore, the Colonial Office decided that disbanded soldiers should be settled in Trinidad. By the 1851 census reports, there were 43,000 Catholics and 16,000 Anglicans out of a population of 70,000 in Trinidad. The Catholics spoke French, Spanish, or patois, so English was therefore a minority language in Trinidad. Persons who would commit to these objectives were encouraged to migrate to the island, so the English had an incentive to try to move as many English-speaking speakers, whether they were white or black, to the island. The Anglicization agenda summed up as law, language, and religion. So black American ex-soldiers and war refugees were settled in Trinidad at the midpoint between the abolition of the Trade Act, which was Slave Trade Act, 1808, and the full abolition of slavery in 1838. The local planters would have preferred to use the available laborers, that is, the former American slaves, on their estates as workers. They objected to free blacks being settled in the country as independent landowners. No big surprise there. They probably saw it as a threat to their domination. So the first experimental group of settlers were members of the 1st West India Regiment. They were brought to Trinidad around 1809 and quartered at the Orange Grove Barracks, which was disbanded in 1814 and given land in the northeast of the island. The soldiers of the 3rd West India Regiment were settled at Manzanilla in 1819. Another settlement of ex-soldiers and war refugees were placed in the south of the island. It was in these settlements that the Baptist churches were established. In May 1815, His Majesty's ship, the Levant, brought a party of 61 men, 18 women, and 7 children to Trinidad. The first group of refugees, these were from the War of 1812. A second group arrived in July of 1815, and these two groups were settled in the Caroni and Levantil as preparations to house them in the south of the country were not completed. By November of 1815, the third group of refugees, which included 32 men, 14 women, and 17 children, arrived, and they were settled in Naparima, 15 miles east of San Fernando. In conclusion, the soldier Baptists and former slaves were eventually given their own land in the south part of Trinidad, which was the least populated and the least developed part of the island. They were not given sufficient tools and resources to successfully develop farming, so it was hard-going and mostly subsistence farming rather than commercial farming. They formed African Baptist churches, which developed in isolation. They lived in close proximity to former African slave descendants who continued to practice remnants of African religions and traditions. So, as we move into talking about the spiritual Baptists, which we pick that up sometime later in our history, let's keep in mind that these African Baptist churches developed in isolation, but they also developed in close proximity to former African slave descendants who continued to practice various forms of African religions and traditions. So they were in isolation from white civilization, I would assume, is what they're saying. But they were definitely in a position to be influenced by other uh, Afro Trinidadians or blacks in Trinidad who were continuing to practice remnants of their African culture and African religion. These were the heroic slave soldier saints who came from the 13 colonies fighting for the British, won their freedom, were relocated to a very poor and difficult part of Trinidad with insufficient resources, and yet were able to survive and develop their own Baptist churches and their own Baptist local culture. Were these soldier Baptists the religious ancestors of the spiritual Baptists? No one really knows for sure. It's only conjecture, as there is insufficient historical evidence, but it certainly seems to me to be more likely than other theories that we will see in the week to come about the history of the spiritual Baptists. So, slave soldiers and saints. Thank you very much. I'll see you in class next week.